Brief word about recent events surrounding the Haredi draft law. So, as we know, there's been a years-long political fight here in Israel about whether or not Haredim, the so-called ultra-Orthodox, need to face a compulsory draft to military service the way other sectors of the Jewish part of society do here in Israel. And there's a whole lot of back and forth about that. And I want to start by saying that I hope to argue that everyone or at least everyone representing the major sides in this argument has something compelling and persuasive to say. And also, everyone is going about it wrong right now. And it's a little bit arbitrary where to start with that. But I think first trying to acknowledge what's positive and persuasive about the arguments being made by both sides. So the easiest point to make, and this is the one that gets the broadest distribution because it's obviously the most popular point in the broader society outside of Israel, is that if you're going to have a society that has a compulsory draft and relies on a culture of national service, there is something very problematic about taking one sector of society and exempting them from that obligation and setting up the perception that these people over here are doing things that might be dangerous, for which they're not getting paid very much, and they're risking themselves in some way in order to defend the society and protect it, especially in times of war. This is a very painful thing to be talking about in that regard. And then others in the same society are not having that asked of them, and instead are getting to engage in an activity that they want to be engaged in ostensibly instead of doing dirty, dangerous work. So, we have to put the asterisk that, of course, not everyone is compulsorily drafted into combat. And so it's already the case that talking about army service, it's a much broader category of things. The IDF is a very big, complex organization with a lot of different roles in it. So it isn't as stark as saying this guy goes straight to the battlefield and this other guy gets to stay at home and experience no danger. But that extreme caricature does parallel to a certain degree the underlying problem from the perspective of the more secular and left-leaning part of society, saying, look, since the beginning of the state, national service has been part of the ethos of the society, and we contribute and we believe in it, and shouldn't everyone? And if not, then that isn't fair. So that's not the whole argument that people make. And obviously people from the more secular and left-leaning side in making this argument tend to also heap on a lot of more nasty claims about Haredim in Israeli society and what's so terrible about them, and the differences in economics and those different, between, let's say, the more highly educated and cosmopolitan sector of society and the tax burden that they bear versus, the net receipt of benefits or payment of taxes by the Haredi sector society, which tends to be poorer, but perhaps poorer by choice to some degree because of a chosen lifestyle that isn't very economically productive by comparison to others. Although all of those, you'd have to maybe unpack those issues, really examine how true they are. But the point is, that's where people are coming from the more secular, centrist left, and leftwards from there. And really, even, it's an argument that has currency in what you might call the national religious right to some degree, which does serve very committedly as a sector of the population in the army and indeed in combat, where you can say, look, we're in a dangerous part of the world. Everyone has to chip in, and why aren't these people chipping in? And what are they doing instead? And is that really fair? That question really captures or that argument captures the hearts of a lot of people when they look at this issue. There's certainly something compelling to be said for that argument. But now let's, give credit to some of the sort of opening arguments of the other side, which also, are more compelling than we sometimes hear acknowledged. And that is that you might say, coming from the Haredi sector of society, that this argument is not what people say it's about. Right? What they might say is, you say this is about contributing to society and defending society, but actually, this is about brainwashing. This is about taking Haredim and putting them not just into a situation where they're supporting the defense of the country, but into an organization that is historically dominated by the secular left and which has its own codes of ethics and its own ideological system that it's very eager to inculcate and to teach, which is not the Torah and which is not based per se in Judaism. It may have some overlaps with it, but it really, also derives from a lot of European philosophy that has influenced very heavily how the ideological creators of the ethos of the IDF, want things to be and how it seems to them they should be. And to the degree that that's the case, we're talking about the proposition to a young Haredi man being, your job now is to go and be an employee of the state for a certain number of years, and you will be put in a situation where you're not guaranteed that the circumstances that you're going to have to work in will match with all the requirements of your religious observance and your lifestyle that you've had up until this point. And not only that, you may be very aggressively bombarded with various attempts to expose you to a different ideological system, one that's much more Western, much more cosmopolitan, that has much more 20th or 21st century ideas about gender and about sexuality and all of these things that are not necessarily what you're taught in the Haredi world. And it's clearly the case that those far enough to the left in the more secular part of Israeli society view this as a positive, right? That they don't just want Haredim to serve in the army because it's fair. They also think, oh, well, they'll come up better on the other side because maybe, they'll have to work side by side with, although, male, they'll have to work side by side with a female soldier and treat that female soldier the way that the army requires, instead of the way that they have been taught to negotiate interactions between the sexes in their, more closed or more traditional community. And isn't that just a good thing because we're teaching better values to people who have backward values, right? I mean, so this is also a bit of a caricature, but that is the argument, or one of them, coming from the Haredi side, that this is really about an attempt to infiltrate and ideologically reprogram Haredi society, and to do so in a way that isn't just about trying to convert people over to sort of the more kind of secular cosmopolitan way of living, but even also has a more sinister and creepy aspect where it's about subservience to the state, right? Where you kind of have to kiss the ring. Like, you're allowed to be who you are, but you have to accept the boundaries that the state will set for how you can be. And you have to have experience acculturating yourself to the idea that you owe fealty and obeisance to the state, whose ethos is fundamentally more secular and more left-wing, right? And it's fair to say there's a certain amount of that that's going on in the background here. There are, especially when you listen to plenty of Israeli politicians who represent the more secular crowd, when they're talking about the need for this, it isn't simply about defending the country and making sure that we have more boots on the ground because we're desperately short of men in boots holding rifles. And of course, if we just get some Haredim to do that, then, we can hold the line better. That everyone understands is not the full story because, as we said, the army is a very complex, large organization, lots of different roles that are going to be filled in it. The question of exactly which roles are going to be filled by Haredim who get drafted, they're not immediately going to be fighter pilots and generals and cyber warfare experts and special forces commandos. Uh, Access to those opportunities, actually, as it's known, is very much partly, about the kind of opportunities you have to be connected to before you go to the army, which has to do with the social and cultural and sort of sectoral environment, part of the society that you're coming from. So it becomes a whole complex discussion, right? So we have on the one hand this idea of, well, isn't it fair that everyone should serve? If, some people are going to serve and risk their lives, then shouldn't everyone serve and risk their lives? And we have to defend the country. And isn't it even, to add another argument, corrosive to allow a deepening rift in society where there's a sector of society that everyone sees is, believes itself to not be bound to contribute to the defense of the society in this way, and doesn't that produce a sort of sense of dissociation and separation within society that could ultimately be very harmful down the line? Don't you want the army to be a mechanism for producing unity, right? And on the other side, you have again this concern, very valid concern, really, that going to the army is not just about serving and contributing and defending. It may even principally not be about that, insofar as we can add some other arguments here now, on the Haredi side, giant state-run institutions that are addicted to cheap labor that's produced by state coercion don't necessarily use all the sort of headcount that they have efficiently. And so it is perhaps principally not about manpower per se, when people are having this political argument, but rather about the symbolic importance of everyone showing the same fealty to the state, everyone having to be, a slave to the state for 3 years, so to speak, to put it, in harsh terms. And to the degree that that's the case, we're even we're even talking about something that doesn't necessarily impinge on the defense of the country, but really is more principally about getting the experience of having to do what the state tells you to do, and perhaps while doing that, being told to do something that isn't necessarily an efficient use of your labor, right? Because there's no presumption necessarily that a giant state-run institution that's addicted to cheap labor produced by state coercion is necessarily going to take a whole bunch of new people who've now been forced to work for it and find good use for their skills and talents and labor, right? So that also is a concern. And we could make one further argument that is perhaps the most important and most compelling one, and that is that Haredim, if we try to go to the other extreme and we say, okay, well, but let's not worry about this thing of, well, maybe they're not going to actually defend the society. Let's presume that they are going to defend the society, right? That they somehow are going to equally contribute to national defense, and they're going to go to the battlefield also. And that is what this is about. It's fundamentally about national defense. So from the standpoint of Jews who are interested in keeping the Torah, it's legitimate for them to ask the question, well, if I'm going to go to the army and I'm going to have to do what I'm told in that army, is that army going to give me orders that are based on what the Torah would recommend or command for how I should fight a war and how I should defend the country? Or is actually there another code that is going to determine how those orders and those sort of principles governing my actions are to be taught and communicated and inculcated and determined and elaborated and interpreted and all of that? And indeed that is the case, right? That the idea of Torah neshek, like purity of arms, the central ethical code for the IDF, that isn't the Torah. It's a different source of ethical foundation that the army touts very proudly. And it's legitimate from the standpoint of Torah and from the standpoint of a Jew who wants to keep the Torah to raise the concern, well, am I going to actually be allowed to accomplish a mitzvah through this service, or am I going to be barred from doing so because actually there's this code that comes from elsewhere, actually really significantly from the writings of German philosophers, ironically and very painfully, which is going to tell me that it's forbidden for me to keep the Torah in a certain situation and fight the war the way the Torah would have me fight the war. And that's not just a sort of a concern of someone who wants to be very proper and follow halakha as carefully as he can. It's also a concern from the standpoint of someone who said, look, if I'm going to risk my life, I want to do it in the way that the Torah would justify, meaning that, yes, warfare is dangerous for those who fight it. And so you can't say, I want to go out to battle, but I don't want to be somehow in danger. But it is reasonable, perhaps, to say, I don't want to be more frequently endangered because of a code that isn't the Torah, that's saying that I have to be in danger because although the Torah would say in this situation, we should just, for example, take down the building. And that's what we would figure out from halakha if we asked ourselves, what would we do in this situation? That because the UN says this, or because the Hague says that, or because this code that was concocted by particular left-leaning secular Israeli professors who like German philosophy says that we don't take down the building. Now you have to go room to room and get shot at, and maybe with higher probability get injured or chas v'chalila killed in the same circumstance. That becomes a highly legitimate question for someone to be asking, right? So if Haredim in this argument were saying, well, it's true that it could be corrosive in our society for us to just kind of sit things out and not participate in the ethos of national service, and that could produce a lot of division and tribal hostility down the road, and we don't want that. And it's also the case that we benefit from the army defending us, and we should contribute to that. Let's suppose that we're inclined to spot or stipulate all of those things. It might still be quite legitimate for them to say, but that's not what you're asking me to do. First of all, you're not asking me to actually do things that will measurably improve the safety and security of the society. You're just asking me to submit to state employment through coercion for a few years and then sit through seminars on whatever kinds of 21st century cosmopolitan Western values the army wants to force feed me, right? So someone could say, like, look, the idea that in order to have equal standing in this society, I have to go and be a barber employed by the state on an army base, and then sit through seminars about the values that are popular in Europe and America that the army is going to make me sit through. That's not a thing that is worth giving up on what the Haredim say they're going to go do instead, which is study Torah, which is more important. That already is, maybe an argument. And they might also say on top of that, okay, but even if you're going to say, I am going to contribute to the defense of the society, I'm going to be doing things that maybe are dangerous, I'm going to be doing things that really are doing what an army's supposed to be doing, which is going and fighting the enemy. Even in those circumstances, the question that could be raised is, am I going to be sent on a suicide mission because of political considerations in the Hague or in the UN? Am I going to be sent on a suicide mission because the fundamental ethos of the army is not Judaic and is not based in Torah, but instead is based in principles that would more frequently ask Jewish soldiers to endanger their own lives, when the Torah would say, don't do that, because of principles that are coming from a foreign source? that is a religious problem of the highest order that it's very difficult to question or argue against if someone wants to push back about that. So if Haredim were by and large saying, look, I would love to be in a crack unit of Haredi commandos who can fight this war according to the Torah, do what we need to, figure out what the halacha says, hit the enemy as hard as we can, not worry about what the Hague says, and we get to do that, with all of the different observances of the Torah that we, want to impose on ourselves, and we want to do this in a way that insulates us from any kind of aggressive ideological indoctrination the army might by default be trying to expose us to, having to do with all of these ideas that are not rooted in Torah, but where there's someone else's agenda to re-educate us. If we can, get rid of all that, then we'll do it, and we'll do it proudly, and we'll do it happily, right? And there are some Haredim who are saying that, and B'ezrat Hashem, there should be more. But the fact is that that is not what you hear by and large, especially from the political leaders of Haredi parties, if we're involved in the negotiations surrounding the draft law, for example. What you much more frequently hear is an argument more like, well, yes, it's true that riding around in tanks and getting shot at and shooting at the enemy is part of what keeps the society safe. And it's not even necessarily always so easy to get some of these people to say this, but some of them do. They say, and we're very grateful for that, and that's important. But also, what's important? Sitting in a kollel or in a yeshiva and studying Torah. That also guarantees the future of the society. Or to make it, even more controversial, that also secures the society, that also protects the society. And it starts to be a bit magical in the way people talk about it, right? The worst kind of thing that you hear is basically, what you're doing in the tanks is just a lack of faith, right? If I sit in a kollel and I study, this many pages of Gemara, the zechut, the merit of that's what's really defending the society. That's, what's going to guarantee HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ashgacha, his oversight of what's going on. And so who even needs, these people in tanks? The real defenders of this society are the ones who are sitting and plowing through page after page of Torah every day, because we know that Talmud Torah Lishma, the study of Torah for its own sake, is so beloved to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that by a mechanism we couldn't possibly imagine or understand, we get divine protection sort of as reward for that activity. And so how dare you suggest that people who want to study Torah instead of going and sitting in a tank are not defending the society? Perhaps they are even doing more to defend the society. That's maybe a caricature, although one has heard various leaders in the Haredi community say almost exactly that over the years, from politicians and from Gedolei Torah and from Roshei Yeshiva and all sorts of people of that sort. So I would say that's the worst extreme of what you hear, and that immediately has to be attacked as rank idolatry, where we're claiming that performing mitzvah A has the magical power of producing by no natural mechanism comprehensible a result that we want, and we just have a sort of vending machine relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where we perform this ritual activity over here that has some spiritual significance, and then we get a magical result over here that's mechanistically unrelated, but which we know is reliable and we can take to the bank. And so we're just getting all of the protection that we need by doing this thing that seems to have nothing on its surface to do with protection, right? That is a golden calf. That is not what the Torah teaches us about how we should relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's not what Chazal teaches about how we should relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chazal make fun of the idea in specific passages, for example, in Masechet Ta'anit, that you should treat Talmud Torah as a magical tool for your own protection. And they do so very delicately by wanting to acknowledge that there is great merit in Talmud Torah, And HaKadosh Baruch Hu does see the merits of our deeds and does account for them. But at the moment you start treating it like it's a potion that you can drink that gives you superpowers, you have chosen the path of idolatry and you're going to reap the whirlwind that you've sowed, right? So if we go to that extreme, it's very easy to deflate. And that's part of the tragedy of this situation, because like we said before, there are some very good arguments that the Haredim could be making for why the current situation is not acceptable. And some of them are making that argument. Some of them are saying, look, we don't want to be brainwashed into another religion that is still clinging to some kind of power base that it has inside the top brass of Tzahal, of the IDF. That's a very legitimate point, where we don't want to be enslaved to the state and not actually really participating in defending the society, but more just sort of being enculturated and showing obeisance to the secular state, and as some kind of symbol of our subjugation or castration, or however you want to put it, that will satisfy the secular left in this country, right? Those are very good arguments. Or the other one saying, like, look, if you want me to fight, then I'll fight, but I want to fight according to the Torah. And if you're going to send me to experience unnecessary danger because of someone else's gods over there in Europe or over there in America, or in the halls of the philosophy department at Hebrew University, where you have a bunch of people who really like German philosophers, I'm not going to do that, because suicide for the sake of idolatry is human sacrifice, and that's not a good idea, right? Those are all fantastic arguments. And here and there, you do hear them being made by people who are advocates for the stubbornness of the Haredi community with regard to this issue of the draft law and everything. But you do hear, as we said, a whole lot of people just basically saying, no, Talmud Torah is just as important for protecting the society. And it magically does that. And so we're really contributing as much, or perhaps, more. So leave us alone and keep paying for those stipends that go to, people studying in Kollel, et cetera, et cetera. It works. Don't knock it, right? That, as we said, is basically idolatrous argument. It unfortunately is a common one, because idolatry of that kind is sadly quite common in the sort of ideological system of Harediut, right? It's all part and parcel to putting up pictures of tzaddikim and the participation of many in the rites of fire worship in Meron and all these other things that have nothing to do with the Torah, but do have to do with a culture that has developed that is about worship of Gedolim, the elimination of the questioning spirit that leads to the questioning of authority, and that leads to political independence of individuals, and that therefore results in a stultified political process of letting political leaders be the ones that use the organized might of the community in the voting booth to leverage from the rest of the society certain kinds of benefits that then get handed by the political leaders to the Rosh Yeshiva and Gedolei Torah, and it becomes like a whole ecosystem that works after a fashion, but is not working based on Torah per se. It's working based on mechanisms of really diasporic survival that are now being applied in relationship to the fledgling Judaic society. And so that, needs to be fixed. But we could even move the argument a notch away from ridiculousness and from idolatry, as common as it is to hear that kind of argument. And it's still a problem, right? Because the next level that you might hear, and you hear this argument again being made by many people, is it's not that Talmud Torah magically protects the society. It's that, and this is maybe consistent with a recent statement by Moshe Gafni, who's a Haredi political leader in the Knesset, is that yes, we have soldiers and we have an army and we appreciate that, but then there's the question of what are we fighting for? What is this society about? What is its purpose? And there we must not forget that this is the Jewish state, and what makes Jews Jews is, for the most part, that their ancestors kept the Torah for thousands of years. Like at this point, for the last several centuries, because of the Enlightenment in Europe and emancipation and various things, you have a lot of people who are several generations estranged from observance of the Torah and commitment to it and having it be a big part of how they live their lives. And nonetheless, because we're talking about thousands of years, most of the time going all the way back, for almost all Jews, almost all of their ancestors since the destruction of the temple were living in communities where the major point of life was to keep the Torah together. And that's what kept them Jews. And that's why there are Jews to be in a Jewish state today. And so to the degree that that's the case, there's a kind of argument from tradition. Well, why don't we just say that there's the defense of the society, and that's important, but there's also the soul of the society, and that's important as well. And that defending something that is empty and that has no anchor, no core, no heart that keeps on beating and that keeps on having the same, sort of soul that's being pumped through the body, so to speak, that isn't worth doing. And so Torah is the soul of Yahadut. And so the Haredi community they're the custodians of the soul of the society. And they're fighting for the future of the society by studying the Torah so that it can be maintained and, breathe life and spirit and purpose and meaning into the life of the society. Right? So maybe that's a stronger argument that could be made, but still one now that we have to question. And we have to question for various reasons. One of them is the question of whether indeed it's the case that the custodianship of Torah in the hands of the Haredi community in Israeli society is something that really redounds to the benefit of the society as a whole, without resorting to magic, right? If you're going to resort to magic, then you're back to that other argument, saying, oh, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees the merit here, and then for the sake of that merit, he sprinkles blessing, everywhere, and everyone benefits, and the magical shield stays up, right? You're not going to talk in those terms, those idolatrous terms that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to include in the way we relate to him. I think you can argue clearly from various parts of our tradition that are authoritative. Then you have to instead say that it must be somehow that by knowing all of this Torah, the Haredim are kind of playing the role to some degree of what maybe Levim and Kohanim used to, have to be, which is people who got a kind of extra stipend of food from the society. And then it was also their job to be more learned and to go around teaching Torah and making sure that people, stayed current with what the Torah was. And the question is, to what degree is it the case that the Torah study that goes on in the Haredi community actually sort of overflows its container and suffuses in the society as a whole with proper standards of Torah? If that's supposed to be the goal, and I'm not sure that actually when people are being taught in yeshivot in these communities that they're told this is the goal, right? That you should have this kind of emissarial and loving relationship to the rest of the society and be making sure to instill in them a great love of Torah by communicating to them everything you know about Torah. Perhaps that is, the typical message, but practically speaking, it somehow doesn't always seem to come across that way. In any case, even if that's the goal, that isn't in practice working right now. That's not what's happening. That's not the effect in the main that you're getting from the existence of these institutions. You can't take that too far, because it's certainly true that there are benefits of that kind. I mean, the most basic one people talk about is the demographic one, which is that the number of Jews in the society is partly being propped up by the increased or the higher birth rates in the Haredi community. And that's not anything to sneeze at. It's important to populate the Jewish state with Jews, and that's a great thing that Haredim are doing. At least, when we're putting all the weights on the scale, and we can treat that as a merit in favor of the system. But if we're talking about, contact, it's true that there are things about the institutions of the society that have to be more kasher and more oriented towards Torah because of the demand for those things from the Haredi sector itself, and because of all of the accommodations to make things sufficiently kasher for that part of the economy and that part of society that ends up sort of filtering into what kinds of options are offered everywhere. So again, that's another thing you could say is a merit, a weight on the scale in that direction. But if we're talking about the actual encounter of people who are, going to talk about Torah and where awe before Hashem and love of Torah are something that's so compelling and apparent in the encounter with Haredi society that the rest of the society has, that it sort of filters out, and it also filters out through conversation. It also filters out through deliberate attempts at teaching. That just simply isn't the norm currently to a sufficient degree. Of course, you always have efforts at what's called kiruv, where people are trying to, find people, Jews who are not so religiously affiliated, and get them more interested. And that happens to a certain degree when that's the organized goal. But if you're taking the bulk of the society that spends so much time studying Torah and Yeshiva within the Haredi world, I don't think you can argue that each one of them is on a mission to go out and make sure that there's enough contact with the rest of the society and deliberate conversation with the rest of the society that brings Torah to the fore in a way that makes the Torah compelling, that you could argue that that's really a benefit. And if anything, the stereotype, and maybe not a totally unjustified stereotype, is we're talking about communities that, because of the culture of diaspora, are comfortable being in enclaves, are comfortable with being clannish and more closed and oriented towards their own issues and their own mores, and trying, even deliberately, going back to what we said about the army before, to avoid being put in situations where there's that kind of contact, because there's this worry of, well, what if this yeshiva bacher gets too much exposure to this other world and this other way of living, and he decides he wants to abandon Torah, right? So that is not, practically speaking, the benefit that society is deriving right now from the current situation. And one can go for a step further, and this is, maybe the sharpest point, and say, how do we know the quality of the Torah study that is being supported in part by state funds that's going on across this sector of Israeli society, right? The problem is that we have funds that have been collected through tax money into state coffers that then, through political process, go back out to different places. They go to all sorts of places, all sorts of wrong-headed places, right? There's a whole lot of vile anti-Israel, anti-Jew, anti-Zionist ideology that is manufactured in the halls of Hebrew University by academics who have been schooled in ways of thinking about the world that are oriented towards the eventual destruction of the Zionist project. There was a recent scandal there where one professor was suspended because of statements that she made. And, for every professor like that, there's 10 or 100 more who have said nearly identical things and are still chairs of departments, because that's how, academia works everywhere these days, but it's, particularly here, it's been the case for a long time. So state money is going to things like that, and you should not ever scrutinize the Haredi community without also scrutinizing the social sciences and everything to the left of that, and Har Tzofim in Yerushalayim, for example, or in Tel Aviv University. But that being said, the current situation is that the Haredi community to the degree that it gets state support for Torah study, does not really get checked by the standards of the people whose tax money is paying for this, for the quality of what is being called Torah study that's going on. This is just a classic case of socialism at some level, right? Where you're spending other people's money, and even if your goal were to get great Torah study to happen, you wouldn't necessarily say that the first step is to gather everyone's money together in a pot that's coercively taken for taxes by the state. And then the next step is for a political process to decide how that money is handed out. And then you're going to get just endless amounts of high quality product, right? We don't get high quality products from that socialistic process in any number of other imaginable circumstances where state coercion is used to take money from A to spend money by giving it to B on a product that only C can judge the quality of, right? When that's happening in the context of government spending, you almost invariably get garbage, right? And to a degree, there already are problems with things like socialized healthcare. At least with healthcare, the consumer of the healthcare product is the person receiving the care, and so they can decide whether the system is working for them, right? But it is all too easy in the case of something like Talmud Torah to say, well, this guy who's sitting in a kollel thinks the system is working for him because he's getting supported to do what he's doing, and then whose job is it to ask whether the activity he's actually engaged in is of a high enough quality to justify what he's being paid in essence by the state to do? So even if our goal, as we said, was to have this sector of society engage in a lot of Talmud Torah, the argument should be that it should be funded privately somehow. It should not be funded by the state in any way, because we're just going to get an inferior product. And indeed, it's probably the case to some degree that that's what's going on. And part of the inferiority of that product goes back to the frequency with which we hear it said that Talmud Torah Lishma has this beneficial effect on its own, right? That studying Torah for its own sake just brings blessing and merit to society. Is that really what the sages taught us, right? Like, of course, you study Torah every day because it's part of halakha that you're supposed to do that. And you don't say, all right, I'm only going to study the parts of the Torah that I want to use right now. But if you don't study the Torah in order to apply it, there's a huge question of whether there's a point to doing that, right? Like, of course, you might study it today so you can apply it a year from now or tomorrow. But if you're studying it with a willful obstinacy not to apply it, then that's a sure sign that there's something pretty twisted and upside down about your relationship to Torah, where you see intrinsic value in studying it at the same moment that you also are insisting it is forbidden to you to ever apply it. And the best example that we see of this, of course, is in the Mikdash, the temple, that there's a widespread opposition to raising the issue of, now that we have the land and we're here in our Jewish state in the land in Jerusalem and everything, we in principle have Haredi in our hands, although we try to pretend we don't, and cede sovereignty as much as possible wherever we can. Now that we're in that circumstance, shouldn't we be trying to keep these hundreds of mitzvot that have to do with the Mikdash? And if the answer is no, that's forbidden. There's a placard over the entrance to Beit HaMikdash that is put there by the head of the Rabbanut, the chief rabbi of Israel, who represents the values of the Haredi community, that says it's forbidden according to Jewish law to go up to Har HaBayit, which is not true. But that's the position. And the position is, don't open that door. It's been closed for thousands of years. We're trying to reproduce the traditional activities of diasporic behavior that include all of the sort of enclaves and, let's say, mothballed mitzvot that don't get considered except through theoretical study. Right? That model, that galut model, to the degree that that is what this grand institution of all the Talmud Torah instead of army service that's going on that's so important for society, to the degree that that's the essence of what we're talking about here, that's a profoundly serious problem with the current situation because it means that we have the state supporting institutions whose goal is to prevent Am Yisrael from keeping the whole Torah that they now have the opportunity to keep. And all the while saying that it is of value to study all of these mitzvot theoretically only for their own sake without the aim of doing them, and that it benefits society that someone's doing that instead of sitting in a tank, right? So at the end of the day, you can see arguments from both sides, right? Most of what we've examined is, I guess, sort of merits and demerits of the Haredi position, because I think that the position of people accusing them or arguing for their drafting is much simpler for the most part. It's just saying, well, the society needs to be defended. Why should some people be exempted? And, isn't it good perhaps also to make them go into the army so they can get brainwashed into desiring to serve the state more and perhaps being more secular, et cetera, right? So there's the sort of compelling side of that argument, which has to do with national unity and national defense. And there's the ugly side of that argument that has to do with the evangelism of a religion other than Judaism that is trying to get the coercive long arm of the state behind it, or, is trying to keep it behind it because it has had that coercive arm behind it for a lot of the early history of the state, right? On the Haredi side, what we've talked about is there's the best arguments for why the current situation where the draft is being insisted on is not acceptable, because Haredim should not accede to being brainwashed by the state or by the army if the goal really is more to acculturate them into a system not based on Torah than it is to actually improve the national defense. And also, they should insist on being able to defend the country according to the Torah and not risk their lives unnecessarily because someone wants them to defend the country according to the teachings of false gods instead, right? So there's plenty of good arguments for why the obstinacy of the Haredim actually could be justified, but it's also sadly the case that while some of them may be making those arguments, a whole lot of others are making idolatrous arguments about how studying Torah for its own sake magically protects us, or making unconvincing arguments about how Torah study by Haredim guarantees the future of the Jewish state and its Jewishness, despite the fact that at an institutional level, all of the agency capture and socialist rot and everything else is producing a low quality product that isn't really filtering into the society and benefiting it in all the ways that it should. So we have those arguments, back and forth, and now the question is, what should be done in these current circumstances? And that's a very hard question. It's one that has to be answered with an incremental move, because what we've pointed to are problems that really are monumental, and they're big ones that have to do with the future of the society on a longer time scale, and how Harediyut or ultra-Orthodoxy is going to evolve, and how non-Harediyut or non-Datiyut, meaning not non-ultra-Orthodoxy or non-Orthodoxy for that matter, are going to evolve over time. And so it's a much bigger set of questions. But if we're going to just talk in terms of what would be an incremental solution, it seems like an important thing that needs to come into the picture at a policy level, at a legislative level, when people are figuring out solutions to the current crisis, is the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the Haredi position, that the goal of this can't simply be to try to increase the rate at which the organs of the secular state can turn Haredim into non-Haredim. Or for that matter, make them kiss the ring and go and risk their lives for reasons that run counter to the Torah. That second point is going to be very hard to get anyone to acknowledge in current negotiations. But I think the point is, to the degree that those arguments are there and they're legitimate, is legitimate for people who want more participation in supporting national defense from Haredi society, to acknowledge those kinds of concerns and to make accommodations for them, right? To say, okay, so Tzahal needs to make room for Harediyut inside Tzahal in ways that are not happening currently, right? Where it's not going to be about brainwashing as much, or it's not going to be about forcing people to get in line with a different set of mores, but we're going to create bases that can be run according to Haredi mores or whatever else. Or we're going to offer other kinds of national service opportunities, as people have suggested, in things like firefighting or emergency first response or something, where maybe it's easier to kind of create these different ways of operating. That clearly needs to be part of the picture. And at the same time, it also should be the case that the Haredi community needs to make a move in the other direction, which is to say that if it's the case that the state cannot be trusted when it comes to bringing people into the army and exposing them to other ideas, if the problem fundamentally is that the state's secularism or the state's ideological orientation away from Torah is dangerous, and that's why you can't take people and put them in the army and just expect it all to work out when they're coming from the Haredi community. There should be a similar problem with a transactional relationship with that state that does produce various flows of financial support that are meant to be allowing for great Talmud Torah to happen. It doesn't really make sense, right? At some level, the purchaser of a product exerts influence on the quality and the properties of that product. And to the degree that it's the case that the current political system is generating Talmud Torah with funds that come from tax money that filter through the coffers of this untrustworthy secular state, it should actually be the case that the Haredi community says, you know what, this isn't even good for Talmud Torah. It's not good to have it be the case that there are stipends for yeshiva students coming from this state, because the mechanisms by which those things are determined are going to exert the wrong kind of influence on what we end up doing. And we need to accept that it is incumbent on us to move towards seeking funding from private donors who have standards for the quality of Torah, and that maybe that will lead to an increased amount of participation from the Haredi sector in different kinds of national service, because it won't be that there's a menu of state-funded or state-determined options that include studying in yeshiva or going to serve in Tzahal, but that it would involve moving to a model where Talmud Torah may be one thing that someone tries to spend time doing, but not because that's part of a transaction with a state that is supposedly not trusted when it comes to going to participate in the army that defends that state. So there need to be awakenings and realizations on both sides that it's legitimate for Haredim to say that they want to protect their connection to Torah if they're going to participate more in national service, and the state needs to make room for that. And it's also the case that it doesn't actually benefit anyone in the society to have a rotten, agency-captured, socialistic system funding what we call Talmud Torah. And if we really want high-quality Talmud Torah, and perhaps Talmud Torah that is fully oriented towards the application of that study through the translation of knowledge of how to keep the Torah into the actions involved with keeping the Torah, including with the Mikdash, then we need to awaken awaken that ethos in Haredi society. There are actors who are eager to do so. It's wonderful to see how many Olim Daharabai to the Temple Mount are Haredi, and what that indicates is that there is an awakening happening in that sector of society. And the more we can make a move in that direction, the more it will be possible to find the common ground that's so needed in order to heal the rifts and ensure a really robust national unity that will bring us all together to serving Hashem according to His Torah in the proper way. B'mihira b'yameinu.